Hi, Travis here from Indie Boards and Cards, and we're here today to explain the rules to Flashpoint Fire Rescue. First thing you'll want to make sure you get out of the box is the rules themselves, and we'll try to follow through the format of the rules in this video. The other thing you'll also want to make sure you give to each player are the 2-player aid cards. These will really help you explain the game, and people can kind of look through, and really they do a good job of giving an overview of what the game is about. So the first thing you want to know about Flashpoint Fire Rescue when you play it is that it's a firefighting game, and you probably guessed that by now. It's a cooperative game, so everyone's on the same team. You're not competing with each other. You're all trying to save the victims that are in the burning house. You'll actually win the game if you save 7 of the victims, and you'll lose the game either by having 4 people be lost in the fire, or if you have the building collapse on you. In the game, victims are represented by these little blue circles. You won't know if they're actually victims or just false alarms until you get to them. But if you save 7 of the people, or the pets, if you choose to play with the pets, if you save them, you win the game. If 4 of these are overcome by the fire, you lose. Or if the building is damaged, these little black wooden cubes are the damage markers. If you place 24 of these damage markers on the board, the building collapses and you lose as well. So before we go into the rules, let's explain a little bit about a couple things about the board itself. Each space on the board is represented by a grid coordinate, and you'll see on the 2 sides of the board corresponding to the red 6-sided die are the numbers 1 through 6. And then on the top and the bottom of the board corresponding to the 8-sided die are the numbers 1 through 8. And you'll be using these numbers on the board to figure out when you roll the dice, where things happen. So if I were to roll 1 and a 5, that would correspond to the space here, and conveniently on the board there's a little marker that says 1 and 5 on that space. So the board has a grid coordinate system that corresponds to the dice, and that's how we'll figure out where things happen in the game. The other general principle that we'll explain up front is adjacent spaces. So each space has up to 4 adjacent spaces, being, up, down, right, and left. Those 4 spaces are adjacent, but if a wall is in between your space and a space next to your space, then those spaces aren't adjacent. So anytime in the game, if you say adjacent spaces, it means those 4 spaces, up, down, left, and right, but cannot be a wall between spaces. Spaces that have a wall between them are not adjacent. So with that, let's go into the setup for the game. So now let's talk about setting up the game. We're going to talk about setting up for the family rules first. You'll notice we have the points of interest markers, the damage cubes, the door symbols, the player cards, the player pawns, the fire markers, and the dice. That's what we'll be using for the family game. The other materials in the game are not used in the family game and used for the advanced game, and you can place those back in the box. You can also place back in the box 3 of the points of interest markers, 1 of the false alarms that has nothing on it, as well as 2 of the victims that have people, or in this case a pet. So we can go ahead and put 2 of those victims and 1 false alarm in the box as well. They're extras and aren't needed for play. So as we set up the board, we place on the board the door markers with the door closed symbol on, the darker symbol on each of the door spaces, and again there's an extra 1 of these that we can put in the box as well. The next thing we do is we put fires on the board, and again on page 2 and 3 of the rules there's a recommended first game setup that you can use to put all the fire markers on the board as indicated. After we put the fire markers, we randomly shuffle the rest of the points of interest marker, POI markers, and we place 3 of those on the board. Again, these can be victims or potentially false alarms as well. And we follow the diagram on page 3. give each player their card so they can remember what color they are, and their pawn, which represents the firefighter that they control in the game. All the other materials that are left over from setup should be placed by the side of the board so they're easily accessible. And finally, the last thing you do is each player places their firefighter where they're going to start, and this can be anywhere on the board outside the building itself. And as you can see, two people can start in the same place, and people can be in the same square throughout the game. So that's it, we're ready to go. So now let's talk about taking actions. Each turn you get 4 action points in the family game, and we'll talk about the different things you can do with those actions. The first thing you can do is move. You can move one adjacent space, so either up, down, left, or right, and that costs 1 action point. You can theoretically move into fire for 2 action points. You can't end your turn on fire. Not really recommended. If I were to spend 1 action point, 2 action points to move to this space, I automatically flip the point of interest and see whether it's a false alarm or a person. Flipping doesn't cost any action points. In this case, it's a person. The other move action I can do is move with that person for 2 action points. So moving without a person is 1 action point. Moving carrying a victim is 2 action points. Moving into a fire is also 2 action points. And that covers the move actions. In addition to moving, I can also spend my action points on a number of other things. First is I can open a door, or also I can close that door. And opening or closing a door costs 1 action point. Now that I've opened this door, I'm adjacent to this smoke, and I can take that smoke marker off the board for 1 action point. I can also extinguish this fire for 1 action point. I can flip a fire to smoke, and for another action point, obviously I could take that smoke off the board. So 2 action points to take a fire off the board, 1 action point to flip a fire to smoke. Now you'll note at the end of each turn, any smoke next to fire turns back to fire. So I will not want to actually just flip this to smoke, because at the end of the turn it'll just turn back to fire. And that leads to one important thing about your actions, is that they can be saved from turn to turn. So if I had 1 action point left, rather than flipping that to smoke, I would actually save the action point and put one of these action point markers onto my player card to remember that I've got an extra action to spend on the next turn. So that covers the actions of opening and closing doors and extinguishing fires. The final way in the family game I can spend my actions is to chop. So for 2 action points, I can put a damage marker on a wall, and that's chopping that wall. And a wall with 2 damage markers is destroyed. So if I were to take the chop action twice, basically spend all 4 of my action points, I could put 2 damage markers on this wall, and on a subsequent turn I could move through that damaged wall as if it were not there. So a wall with 2 damage markers on it is treated as destroyed, and for purposes of gameplay, it's no longer there. Now let's talk about the advanced fire phase. So after you've taken your 4 actions, you roll the dice. And what we're doing here is what I call adding smoke. This is how the fire spreads through the game. So let's say, for example, that we roll a 2 and a 5 on the dice, which corresponds to this space. Since that space is empty, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and put a smoke on that space, and that's all we'll do for this advanced fire phase. Now let's say, for example, in a subsequent turn that we actually roll a 1-4, which corresponds to this space right here. Since there's already a smoke in that space, what we'll do is instead of adding a smoke counter, we actually will flip that existing smoke counter into a fire counter. Now things get really interesting when we roll in a space that already has a fire. So let's say we fast forward in the game, and it's after another player's taken their actions, and we roll the 1-4 space again. Because there's a fire already in that space, that space, rather than just adding smoke or changing a smoke to fire, that space will have an explosion. So let's put the die there just to remember that's where the explosion is happening. And what will happen is in each of the 4 directions, up, down, left, and right, we'll do one of 3 things. We'll either add a damage marker, we'll add a fire, or we'll remove a closed door marker. So this is a great example here. If we go left, or right actually, we'll add a fire marker into that space. If we go up, we'll add a damage marker to that wall. The fire can't spread through the wall until that wall is destroyed, so that wall is damaged by the explosion. When we go left, there's a closed door here, and what we'll do is remove that closed door marker. And we don't add any fire or damage cubes, we just remove that closed door marker. And you'll see there's 2 little cubes on the board, and that's just to remind you that a destroyed door is treated as a destroyed wall. You do not place the damage markers on those cubes, you just remove the door marker. And then finally, we place a fire marker on the space below. And as you can see, there's a point of interest in that marker. So we flip it over and oh no, it's a person. This person has been lost to the fire, and we'll place them on the red cross marker on the board to indicate that person's lost. And that'll count against us as one of the loss conditions. If we lose 4 people, we lose the game. So that's a simple example of an explosion. Now let's talk about a slightly more complicated explosion. And we'll go ahead and use the die again to mark where this explosion happens. So the first thing we do is we resolve this explosion in this upward. And you'll notice that the next space, the adjacent space, is one, there's an open door. And then there's a fire in the next space. So rather than add a fire to this space, we have a shock wave that continues until it hits this wall. So it keeps going until it hits this wall, and we'll put a damage marker on that wall. And because the shock wave traveled through an open door, we actually removed the door markers. And that's one of the reasons why you might want to close a door behind you as you go through the door, is that in this case, had that door been closed, it wouldn't have done as much damage. So we go in these directions, and we simply put to the right, we put a fire marker, and down we put a fire marker. And then to the left, again, we create a shock wave, and that shock wave continues, and we'll put a fire marker on the space with the firefighter. And that firefighter is knocked down, basically injured, and the injured firefighter has to go back to the nearest ambulance spot in the family game, and those ambulance spots are marked by the blue spaces on the board. And the final step on each player's turn is making sure that we have replenishing the POIs, making sure that we have 3 points of interest markers in play in the game. So as you'll see here, blue is moved outside of the building carrying a victim, and when we carry a victim outside, that victim is rescued and saved and put on the rescue spot on the board. And then you'll also see that there's only 2 points of interest markers left on the board. So even if this one was flipped over, as long as there's 3 blue circles on the board, we don't do anything on the replenish POI stage. But in this case, because there's only 2 points of interest, we'll actually roll the dice and place a point of interest marker on that space. So we go there. If that space were a fire or smoke in the family game, we actually just take the fire or smoke off the board. So it's a bit of a help for you, and put that point of interest marker in the space that we rolled. So that's it. We've gone through doing our actions, advancing the fire and replenishing the POI, and then it's the next player's turn.